Hi, I'm Vas Bednar, the host of Lately. And today, we're featuring another podcast in the Globe and Mail family, Stress Test. Stress Test is our personal finance podcast for Gen Z and Millennials. It's hosted by the Globe's personal finance team. This Stress Test episode is called Counting on an Inheritance, Not So Fast. Now, inheritance is a super squirmy subject. It's wrapped up in privilege, death, loss, and gain. It's messy stuff. And in this episode, columnist Rob Carrick and editor Roma Lutsiu talk to a few different people about this thorny topic. An Ontario millennial who's decided to take her parents' offer of an early inheritance. Another woman whose parents told her that they're going to spend every last dime. And a financial planner who warns us about not getting too comfy and counting on theoretical money. We'll be back next Friday with a new episode of Lately. But for now, enjoy Stress Test.
What you're about to hear might make you feel envious, angry, or even embarrassed. We did a survey and found that 75% of people under 40 are expecting an inheritance from their parents. Of those people, the majority expect to get at least six figures.
We know this is an unpleasant topic. No one likes to think about their parents passing away. But we thought it was important to find out whether young people are counting on potential future wealth and how that affects financial planning in their 20s, 30s, and 40s. Can it, in fact, be dangerous to count on an inheritance?
Welcome to Stress Test, a personal finance podcast for millennials and Gen Z. I'm Rob Carrick, personal finance columnist at the Globe and Mail.
And I'm Roma Lutsiu, personal finance editor at the Globe. Just mention the word inheritance, and people get their backs up. It's no surprise that people are reluctant to talk about getting free money. So back in May, we did a call out in Rob's newsletter, asking readers for their thoughts on this secretive, sensitive topic. We got over 1,500 responses from people of all ages, then asked a data specialist at the Globe to tease out what the under 40 crowd had to say.
Here are a few highlights from the findings. 3 of 4 expect an inheritance, and half said they've already received money from their parents. People under 40 who are not getting an inheritance have mixed feelings. Many describe themselves as neutral, but 25% said they were mildly jealous and 7% said they felt resentful. The top 2 priorities for people who have or expect inheritance money: pay down the mortgage and put it toward retirement savings.
So there's plenty of emotions surrounding an inheritance, and the situations are as varied as possible from family to family. Here's a comment from that online survey read by one of our producers.
I'm incredibly lucky. I'm a financially secure 40-year-old, already paid off my mortgage, income well into 6 figures, defined benefit pension plan, and I'm likely to inherit land worth $1.5 to $2 million. I'm afraid you won't be getting a quote from me for a story. I'm worried the pitchforks might come out for me.
Other respondents were frustrated about fairness and how hard it can be to get ahead when your peers are getting parental support that you simply won't have.
Not only am I not getting an inheritance, but I bought my parents a house so I wouldn't have to worry about them being evicted into homelessness in their old age.
But the reality is, the vast majority of older established Canadians own their homes, and many of them stand to make a killing off real estate. Even if your parents aren't cash rich, there's a chance you might inherit property.
My sister and I will be inheriting a 1,000-acre cash crop farm in Ontario, and neither of us farm. It's all very overwhelming.
Some people don't expect to get an inheritance for years. Others will receive a living inheritance. That's where parents give money while they're still alive. Like one respondent who received more than $500,000.
I had no idea I would receive early support to this magnitude. I try not to tell my peers about it.
But one thing's for sure, an inheritance at a younger age can be a financial game changer.
My in-laws gave each of their children $150,000. We received the inheritance in 2019, and we paid off our debt and used the remainder to purchase a home.
People don't like talking about inheritances, but we're going to dive right in. After the break, we'll speak with a financial planner about why you shouldn't factor an inheritance into your financial plans. Julia Chung is the CEO at Spring Planning in Vancouver. Julia, what if you could start by telling us how your clients are affected by inheritance? Is everyone getting one?
It depends on what you would consider an inheritance. So a lot of times when I talk to people about estate planning, they say things like, well, I don't have an estate, or people who don't own real estate get very confused. And I think the big thing is that we have to know that everybody's going to die, including the people in your family. And at some point, you are probably going to be involved in the financial aftermath of said death. So whether or not there's an actual receipt of something meaningful as an inheritance, there's going to be paperwork.
What about situations where you have young clients, let's say they're millennials, they've been in the workforce for a while, they're starting to get savvy about money, and they're starting to understand that their parents are getting on, they have assets. How often are they talking to you about the inheritance they expect to get or maybe already got?
I would say probably not a lot. I do more often talk to their parents than to the millennials themselves. Most of the millennials I do talk to will say, I'm not expecting anything. My parents might, in fact, live forever. But occasionally I'll run into people who say, I'm not worried about my retirement because I am going to inherit a bunch of money. And that one worries me.
Why? Why does that worry you? It sounds like a great situation.
Oh, it absolutely does. There's a couple of reasons why it worries me. Is if we're waiting for somebody to die, that's weird and uncomfortable from a family situation. Two, we really don't know when people are going to die. People are living a very long time these days, especially in first world countries like Canada. And if you're lucky enough to be well off, that you might be leaving an inheritance, you're even more likely to live a longer time. So what are we planning for? If your parents are 20 or 30 years older than you might not get an inheritance until you're 50, 60, 70 years old. And even then, what if those parents live a long time, but don't live healthily? They might spend what you were thinking that you were going to receive.
What are you seeing in terms of how inheritance can affect someone's finances? Young people getting a block of money or expecting a block of money, how big a difference maker does it look like?
It can be huge. I mean, it really depends on where your financial situation actually is. So my younger clients who might be in their 30s and 40s and they're dealing with debt and children and, all the things at that really stressful stage of life, any amount of money is super helpful. But for my older clients who are in their 50s and 60s and receive an inheritance, which is more often when that's happening, they're like, oh, cool, I guess a couple more trips to Italy. It's not, they've already got their finances figured out.
Interesting. So you say some people are traveling with the money. It's a luxury. Are there any people who are getting this money and it's filling in a gap in their own lives? Like, I really wasn't able to save enough for retirement. I got a giant mortgage later in life. Is the inheritance ever solving big problems?
I imagine it absolutely is. And that does come up every once in a while where people are reaching out to me specifically because they suddenly have a chunk of money and they've never had money like this before and they don't know what it means and they don't know how to use it. And that will make a really big difference. What's important to remember, though, is behaviors. Most people have kind of an internal, I don't know, like clock or measurement of what kind of lifestyle I think I deserve to live. And if you haven't done some work around that, by the time you receive an inheritance or any other kind of sudden wealth, very often that money's gone really quickly because you mentally and emotionally can't handle it.
It reminds me that there's almost a sense of shame around the inheritance conversation. Where's this coming from?
Well, I think, in North America in general, we believe that we deserve the things that we personally worked for. And the idea that we're, trust fund kid or something like that is not looked upon very kindly. And even being, what someone else might call rich in a country like Canada is not generally considered positive. And people do feel very guilty about holding wealth that they didn't earn, or even if they did earn it, that it was so much more. And maybe I didn't work harder than the next guy, and yet I've got so much more money. I think it's societal.
This is an interesting segue to the concept of the great wealth transfer. There's all this awkwardness about wealth transfers, but it sounds like a lot of money's coming, like $1 trillion is sort of in play here. What will that look like for the younger generation?
Well, it will look like it'll go to your mom first. So let's wait for her to let's wait for her to live a long time. And this is one of the things I keep talking about with my colleagues in finances, that they're really concentrating on this $1 trillion transfer of wealth that they've been talking about since I entered the industry in like 1997. Still waiting. But what I feel like a lot of people, at least in my industry, don't realize is that women live longer than men on average. And very often women are also younger than their husbands. So the transfer of wealth is going to go, or just the control of it really, is going to go from rich men generally to their rich wives. And then it's going to go out to the younger generations. And it might happen during that rich wife's lifetime because women do tend to distribute and give wealth a lot more frequently.
One of the things I'm thinking of in terms of a interruption in the wealth transfer is, and you alluded to this earlier, longer lifespans, but not necessarily living healthier. Do you think that parents are going to use up some of their money that's projected as to be part of their wealth transfer for their own healthcare not covered by provincial plans, for example?
Absolutely, they are. And I work with a lot of physicians and physicians who work in elder care. Actually, my mom worked in elder care when I was a kid, so I got to see it firsthand. And it's one of the things I'm always factoring into a financial plan when I'm working with people is this is what residential healthcare costs look like in your province today. And let's assume they're going to be a lot more expensive as the baby boomers start going through their own transition. We already have, a well-known healthcare crisis. We have a lot of people who are going to need a lot more healthcare, and we have a system that's not handling it particularly well right now. So the people who can afford good healthcare in their elder years are going to be spending a lot of money on it. I've heard people setting aside as much as $2 million if they're concerned about elder care.
$2 million. That sounds like that's going to eat up a lot of inheritance money there.
I think it will.
Now, traditionally, inheritance is something you receive after someone dies, but people are living longer, and I know more parents want to give their money while they're alive to see their kids enjoy it, the living inheritance. Are you seeing parents doing this?
Absolutely. I see it all the time. And I think the housing crisis has a lot to do with that. So we see a lot of those parents who can afford to make gifts or think they can afford to make gifts to the next generation, doing so that they can help them make a down payment on houses, which probably isn't helping the rising cost of housing by itself anyways, but that's a bigger picture thing. But I am seeing it quite a bit. And I see people saying, I see my kids struggling in an economic environment that is kind of unfair to them compared to how I grew up. And I have this amount of money and I really want to share it with them now. I want to see them enjoy it now.
One of the things about the traditional inheritance is that it's money left over. The deceased doesn't need it anymore. But with living inheritances, parents are using money they might conceivably need later. You alluded to this just a second ago. Do you ever worry that all the money parents are giving to their adult kids for down payments, they're going to need that at some point?
I worry about it so much all the time. And I always talk to them about this if they've come to me and said, okay, well, I want to gift to my kids. I worry the most about, and I think you and I had talked about this in the past, parents borrowing against the equity in their home to give to their kids. And I think one of the problems is that most people have a hard time believing that they're going to live as long as the longevity tables tell us they're going to. They don't believe that they're going to be any less healthy than they are today, and they don't believe it's going to cost a lot of money. So I have to have some pretty frank conversations with people.
Do you think when young people and their parents are talking about inheritances, do you think it's a good idea for the young people to just get an idea whether the parent can actually afford to do what they want to do? I mean, it's these impulses to help are wonderful. That's what families do. But I think that you, as a responsible child, you want to make sure that they can do it comfortably and not affect their own retirement. Should you have that conversation?
Absolutely. And I say to the younger generation, if they haven't kind of thought of it, because sometimes you'll meet somebody who is constantly concerned about their parents and don't know how to ask the questions about whether or not their parents are going to be okay. And I do meet a lot of people who are even factoring into their plans that maybe I'm going to need some extra money for mom and dad because they've always been such givers. But there's, the other side of the equation when we're so used to parents who have been great with money. They've always been good at solving problems. I've never had to solve a problem for my parents. To really just change your thinking a little bit and just remember that if they give you that money, that's money they don't have, which, as I say, do you want your parents showing up on your doorstep when they've run out of money? And if that's not an equation that you want, we need to think about the fact that that gift isn't just a straight up gift and there's no strings attached. The gift between family members is always one that comes with love. And even if your parents say, don't worry about me, I'll be fine, you worry about them. You should. And if your parents were not okay at some point in the future, you'd want to help them. So try to be helpful to them now.
Let's say you're doing a financial plan for a 40-year-old millennial. Do you ask them, do you think you're getting an inheritance?
I mention it, but I never factor it into the plan.
Interesting. Do you ever hear, oh, I'm getting inheritance, so I really don't need to worry about how much I save for retirement, or I don't have to worry about this mortgage I've taken on?
Well, I say, how old are your parents? Are they currently terminally ill? Do you know anything about their finances? Like, where are we getting this idea from? Like, so if the inheritance is coming from somebody that is currently 97 years old, has cancer, and $20 million, yeah, maybe we should talk about it. And what we should be talking about is, do they have a will? Do they have beneficiary designations? Have they done any estate planning? Because you don't know. Even if they die with $20 million after all the taxes come through and the costs come through, it might be 10, it might be less.
I find what you're saying very refreshing, because I've been hearing the great wealth transfer propaganda for ages. And you talk to the financial industry, the asset managers, it's almost like there's going to be this fire hose of money and everyone should just run around with buckets and catch it. Yeah. You've got a sort of a common sense, don't count the money before you receive it attitude. Do you think more people who expect inheritance should do a little personal reality check?
Absolutely. Like, it's just that obvious, don't count your chickens until they're hatched thing. You don't know what's going to happen. And I always say, if you think about the amount of change that has happened in the last 4, 5 years, let alone the last 10, 20, 30 years, what do you think the speed of change and the amount of change is going to happen in the next 10, 20 years? It's going to be so much. We didn't imagine the changes that have happened in the last 5 years. We didn't guess them, as much as people think that you've got the smartest advisors in the world who can tell the future. Zero of them can. And you don't know. So the most important thing you can do is build resilience in yourself.
Julia, thank you. After the break, we'll hear from a woman whose parents plan to spend every dime in retirement.
My name is Dana. I am 31 and I live in the Edmonton area.
Inheritance wasn't on Dana's mind. Her parents kept the topic vague until this past spring.
So the way inheritance recently came up with my parents was this past March. I had taken a holiday and I was visiting them down in their house in California. And one day I was just lounging in the pool and they come up to the side after reading this article on my dad's favorite news site. No, it's not Globe and Mail. It is MSNBC. And it was about how people around my age, so millennials, expect inheritance from their parents. And they were pretty outraged about this. And they're like, Dana, do you expect inheritance from us? And I was like, no, I do not at all. My husband and I are going to save up ourselves. And if there is something, great. And they're like, okay, well, just so you know, we're going to spend every dime. I was like, okay, good to know. The conversation was not awkward at all. It was just definitive. And I thought that was great. They saved up all that money for decades. They absolutely deserve to spend it all.
Even though her parents told her their properties will go to her and her sister, Dana isn't counting on it.
They have 2 properties, one in the Edmonton area and one in California. I don't think about the property value, and that is not a factor in my husband and I's savings because they may decide to sell their residence here or their residence there. I can't bank on that. I know some people do. I find that very risky. And like I said, I am very risk adverse. So I don't think that way, and my husband doesn't either. My husband and I's financial goals are centered around investing for the long term and getting a house in the short term, as is the Canadian way. We have said for a few years, oh, we'll get a house in 5 years, in 5 years, in 5 years. But we finally had to set a date to that. So within 4 years now, we will be buying a house and interest rates will be what they are. And that's the main goal right now.
Dana's parents gave them $25,000 when they got married, but they don't plan to help them with home ownership.
Last year, my husband and I found a piece of land near where we live that we were very interested in buying to build a house on, to have an acreage. I went to my dad and I just put a feeler out and I asked him, hey, would it be possible to borrow or have you loan us some money so we could pay off this land prior to building a house on it? So the mortgage is less. We would pay you back, but it would be over time. I'm expecting a yes. My dad shocks me with a no because he would lose out on interest in the market. So that's the accountant for you. I have not asked since.
Up next, we'll speak with an Ontario woman whose parents have offered her an early inheritance.
I am Melanie, and I'm 39, and I live in a small town just outside of Ottawa.
A few years ago, Melanie's parents approached her and her brother with a proposal. Rather than leaving the two of them their house as an inheritance, which they'd get after they passed away, her parents said they'd be willing to put a reverse mortgage on their home now and use that money to help the two of them upgrade their living situations.
So they approached us with this opportunity, knowing that, frankly, things are harder to afford now than they were when they were our age. So they wanted us to have the opportunity to use the cash now as we're in our late 30s, as opposed to, 20, 30 years from now, when hopefully they are at a very old age and pass away and are able to give us a typical inheritance.
The deal came with one condition.
So that was kind of the stipulation, was that if we decided to cash in, the money would be used for the purpose of our own mortgage.
Melanie and her husband already own their home. They bought it about 12 years ago, thanks to a substantial interest-free loan from her parents. There was no timeline on paying that loan back, but the balance would be deducted from any future inheritance.
We absolutely could not afford it ourselves. We were both making decent, but not a lot of money. And neither of us had been able to save really anything after post-secondary and having been in the working world. Our expenses were always pretty equivalent to our income at the time. So we never had that kind of down payment savings.
Since then, Melanie's family has grown. They now have 2 young children, and the family wanted to upgrade to a bigger home. Accepting the early inheritance would have made this goal easier, and they went through the pros and cons.
Yeah, so my parents are very pragmatic people. They've always been that way. They're not afraid to talk about awkward things, which I really appreciate. So they're not afraid to talk about what happens when we die, or anything else that could be potentially awkward or uncomfortable. They just kind of lay it out practically, which is appreciated. So they came to us after having consulted with their financial advisor, and they just said, here's the options. They put it down on paper to show us the pros and cons. And so I felt really grateful that just grateful in the fact that they were willing to gift us, but also that they were educating us through the process as well. They even showed us the interest appreciation scale, so that we could really understand, if you could take this money now, this is what it equates to. Whereas look at this chart. If you were to wait 20 years, this is what this money becomes for you.
Melanie and her husband could have handled the cost of a new home themselves, but the ability to put down a lot more money and decrease the size of their mortgage and the amount of interest they were paying was very tempting.
There's definitely a temptation. I mean, obviously paying more upfront is is certainly better. And so there was definitely the question between my husband and I, pain now or pain later, ease now or ease later. We don't have a crystal ball, right? And so we don't know 20 years from now. And it doesn't, we could potentially cash in on this opportunity before my parents pass away. It wasn't now or never. But we definitely took the risk in saying, okay, we're comfortable doing what we're doing now with the mortgage. Will this bite us later on where we say, yeah, we really should have cashed in at the beginning? Maybe. But I think we just kind of tried to do our best with the information we have in the moment, which was what we had. And so we made the decision for the current us versus necessarily the future us.
After thinking it through, Melanie and her husband decided to pay for their new home themselves. They turned down her parents' offer of an early inheritance.
First of all, we know we have incomes right now that can support our expenses. We knew that, we hoped that the sale of our house would go well and that we would be able to afford the new house, which we were. And so we just said, if we can afford it on our own, let's let this money appreciate. And so, frankly, it was looking at the numbers that did it for us. So there was not a ton of back and forth. We were working with a mortgage broker at the time. And so we could see our offer was affordable, our new mortgage was affordable, and our money would appreciate so much more if we just let it sit.
Melanie's brother is several years younger and had yet to break into the housing market. The offer of an early inheritance meant something very different to him.
He had been in downtown Toronto where it's less affordable and a bit more precarious work. And so we both kind of treated this opportunity differently. Myself, my husband, and I are in a comfortable position financially, and we were able to sell our home and make a decent situation financially after selling our home. Whereas my brother did accept the gift because they wouldn't have been able to make the down payment without it.
The decision not to take the cash until later was largely pragmatic, but there was an emotional component to it as well.
If I'm being honest with you, there's a certain element of feeling, I don't want to say shame, but feeling a bit embarrassed that we can't do it all ourselves, and not wanting to touch it because we want to prove that we can do it ourselves and that we can manage our own finances and that we can make our own money. And I don't feel it from outside because I think most of my friends my peers are in the same position. But there's definitely a sense of wanting to prove that I can do it. And my parents put absolutely no pressure. It doesn't come from them. It comes from an internal place.
While Melanie and her brother were grateful to their parents for this offer, they did have one big question for them. Can you afford this?
So in terms of them outlining the impact to them, yes, that's how they prefaced everything. They said, we just had a chat with our financial planner who provided this opportunity to us because we are in X situation. And so, it was all very much based on some of their investments and pensions having dividends now that they were able to do this. And so they did explain that whole situation as the preface to here's what we can now do for you. So we didn't have any concerns that it would be an issue for them because they explained that up front. We don't have to worry about them. Although the running family joke is now that they're on a fixed income. And so we cover a lot more meals out than we used to.
It can feel morbid discussing an inheritance, especially if your parents are still relatively young. But it's a personal finance matter you should think about as the so-called great wealth transfer edges closer. Rob, what are your takeaways?
Number 1, a lot of inheritance money will flow from boomer parents to their children, but this isn't something to base all your financial plans on. Your parents may live long into the future and they may need some or all of their money for living expenses and medical care. 2, some parents are giving early inheritances, which can be a huge help. But some parents are taking on debt to do this, and others may be using some of their retirement savings. It doesn't hurt to ask your parents if they're sure they can afford an early inheritance. 3, inheritances can be a touchy subject with your friends. Some millennials and Gen Zs don't have family wealth to be passed along. Also, some will be helping their parents with money.
Thank you for listening to Stress Test. This show was produced by Kyle Fulton, Emily Jackson, and Zara Kozema. Our executive producer is Alicia Sani. Thank you to Julia, Dana, and Melanie for joining us. Next week on Stress Test, we'll discuss how social media fuels our spending. TikTok and Instagram are great at convincing you how to pull out that credit card for things you might not need and can't afford. We'll talk about why it's easy to get lured into spending on everything, from little treats to big vacations.
Until then, find us at theglobeandmail.com. Thanks for listening.